Hey everybody, welcome back to the Horizon's Edge channel, Profiles from the Titanic, where we're taking a look at people on board the Titanic, and that's what makes this story so interesting. And so we've got another really good one for you today. Talk about interesting or intriguing, maybe a better word, perhaps one of the craziest stories of any of the passengers on board the Titanic. And this one has got, lying, kidnapping, using fake alias names, tragic death, and actually survival. This one actually has a little bit of a good news ending at the very end. And I'm talking about the Navratil family, Michel Navratil, who took his two young boys aboard the Titanic, and they were known as the Titanic orphans after the tragedy. And so this one, sometimes they say truth is stranger than fiction. This story is pretty weird, but apparently it did happen. And so Michel Navratil and his two sons today on Profiles from the Titanic. I hope you enjoy it. Michel Navratil was born in Slovakia in 1880. By the early 1900s, he had moved to France and worked as a tailor. He married an Italian woman, Marcel Caretto, in 1907, and in the following 3 years had two sons, Michel Jr. and Edmond. Their marriage faltered, however, when Michel thought that Marcel was having an affair and his business was doing no better. They separated, and in the midst of getting a divorce in April of 1912, the mother had been granted custody of the two young boys, and over the Easter weekend that year, Michel was taking care of them. But the visit was the beginning of his plan to take the boys and start a new life in America by themselves. When Marcel came to collect the boys, they had disappeared. Navratil had traveled to Southampton and bought second-class tickets aboard the RMS Titanic under the fake name of Louis Hoffman, who was a friend of his. The story goes that he told other passengers on board that he was a widower, and he rarely let the boys out of his sight, except for one notable time when he let a young Swiss girl watch them while he played cards. On the night of April 14th, the Titanic struck the iceberg, and when passengers began to be loaded onto the lifeboats, Michel got his sons ready and got them to collapsible boat D, which was one of the last lifeboats to be successfully launched that night. Second Officer Charles Lightoller had his crew lock arms around the boat, and the two boys were passed through the ring of sailors. Michel Navratil was not allowed on the boat with them. Michel Jr., not yet 4 years old, recalled that his father told him that he loved their mother and was hoping that they all would be happy living in the new world. Michel Navratil perished when the Titanic sank. His body was recovered with a loaded revolver in its pocket by the recovery ship, and he was eventually buried in Halifax in a Jewish cemetery due to the fact that he had used the alias name Hoffman. But that was not the end of the story. On board the rescue ship Carpathia, the two young boys did not have a parent or guardian, and they were all alone. They could not identify themselves, and they spoke no English. They were dubbed the Titanic orphans by the press. A 24-year-old first-class passenger, Margaret Hayes, took them into her home until their family could be found. Once the photos of the boys were circulated in newspapers around the world, their mother was able to identify them and sailed for the U.S. She was reunited with her two sons on May 16, 1912, and took them back to France aboard the Oceanic. Younger brother Edmond died in 1953 at the age of 43. He had served in World War II with the French Army and was even a prisoner of war. Their mother Marcel died in 1974, and Michel Jr. became active in Titanic events in the last 20 years of his life, especially after Dr. Bob Ballard found the wreck of the Titanic. He even visited his father's grave in Halifax in 1996. Michel Jr. was the last living male survivor of the tragedy when he passed away in January of 2001 at the age of 92. Thanks for watching Profiles from the Titanic.